Emma Sure to you. Let's just get right into it. There is a global reckoning, not just in Nigeria, that calls for deep reflection about the hard times we are in, about the choices we have made, and whether they are good for us. The IMF's World Economic Outlook is projecting that global growth will slow from 3.5% in 2022 to 2.9% in 2024. The 20-year average has been 3.8%. For ordinary people living in the streets of Ibadan, Lagos, Enugu, Kano, these small global slowdowns represent massive losses. My mom, an old woman, called me to say that her malaria drug rose nearly 100% from 1,200 naira to 2,200 naira within a month. In many developing countries, 9 out of 10 drugs that are used by the most vulnerable people, especially women, children, and the aged, are imported. Dollar politics are factored into local prices. In Nigeria, even the few drugs that are locally manufactured have imported foreign materials or chemicals in their value chain. Here is a picture of the global influence on the lives of common men and women who don't really care about global politics, but only elect leaders based on who is from our tribe. Welcome to today's podcast. It is about the Yoruba, a unique nation within Nigeria. Let's have a conversation about our ongoing political choices and a consequent economic crisis and social unraveling. In the last election, out of 3 or 4 leading candidates, only one loudly and consistently argued that Nigeria's biggest priority is to shift from consumption to production. Of these 4 candidates, 2 hardly ever, if ever, showed up for debates. It is the candidate who campaigned the least, who never showed up for debates and whose economic plan was weakest, or in his words, a continuation of the old administration. It was he who became president. And from day one, this new president unleashed the fastest deterioration in living conditions on those who believed in his candidacy. Despite the untold suffering, the public conversation is still oriented not around sound economic arguments, but around ethnic controversies. Since this last election, Nigeria has descended into a living hell of tribalism, where it is impossible to construct an ordinary sentence about any random topic without inserting tribe. That's why we are where we are today, in the words of my favorite philosopher, a former vice president. And today, we are going to shake the table of one of those tribes, the ethnic group that has become the arrowhead of Nigeria's plunge into new depths of despair and sharp national decline. The Yoruba are a 40 million strong population spread across the world. Our unique heritage is credited as being the most intact survival of centuries of slavery and colonization in the world. Yoruba is so important that 2 decades ago, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization preserved our body of knowledge called Ifa as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Ifa is one of the oldest forms of knowledge known to civilization, over 80,000 years old. The UNESCO Ifa Heritage Institute in Nigeria is the only higher education institute in the world that specializes in the study of all aspects of Yoruba indigenous culture. So, can we talk about the Yoruba and how in 2023 we made a political choice that has turned out to be the unraveling of Nigeria, not only economically, but particularly socially? I start with a reference to 2 stories. In 1965, iconic playwright Chief Gilbert Ogunde produced Yoruba Ronu, It was a call to action and reflection about the decline of Yoruba status within the new nation. Because of its potentially anti-government content, Yoruba Runu was banned. Nowadays, the phrase is misappropriated by a new generation of Yorubas without the intellectual or ideological sagacity and purity of Ogunde's original intention. I'm going to pause here and read for you an interview with the son of Chief Ogunde to illustrate how what I call the tragedy of when our education systems are kind of shallow or hollow. So people know that the phrase exists, but they don't know the history behind it. So they begin to misuse it. Let me read what the son of the playwright said. In a 2022 interview with Punch, Oluwemimo Ogunde, a former Attorney General of Ogun State and one of Ogunde's children, insisted that his father's message was not of Yoruba supremacy, but about Yoruba unity. According to Attorney General Ogunde, Yoruba Ronu was actually to castigate Yoruba and those who are not Yoruba. It was to let all Yoruba understand that the destruction of Yoruba would be from the inside and not from the outside. So we won't have outsiders to blame. We will have our own internal wrangling to blame. He also said, the play now has been misused to actually show that my father wrote against other national ethnic groups. That is not correct. The play had nothing to do with other ethnic nationalities. It was to ensure unity among Yorubas. And yes, the play was to promote Awolowo, but much more than that, there was disunity in Yoruba land and it wasn't going to help us. When Ogunde and his son say that we have a problem with unity among Yoruba, the question you should ask critically, unity about what? I don't think it was unity about personalities like Awolowo or Akintola or the current political personalities. I do think, knowing a little, the little that I know, or the much that I know about personalities like Ogunde and Awolowo and so on, and their class of Yoruba people, it was a clash of values. I believe that Ogunde saw in Awolowo a reflection of himself and his own values, the kind of Yoruba race that he aspired to. Ogunde was the finest of his time. He was the finest of his time, and he wanted to aspire to leadership that represented that. And he thought that all Yorubas, because of how highly civilized we claim to be, should aspire to follow leadership that reflected those values. And he was worried that rather than choose leadership based on values, that Yorubas were choosing leadership for all kind of personal interests and all kind of anti-other ethnicity interests that were ended up dividing the Yoruba vote so that we could not give our full support to the Yoruba candidate who best represented the then Western region. So I do think that the division, I think this is my own personal opinion, that the division that Ogunde was warning us against was not a division of which party you want to join, was a division of what values do Yorubas represent, and therefore who best represents those values for us, and can we unite around the fact that we believe in these things and therefore this candidate best leads us in that direction. This will become clear as we continue in this podcast. After Yoruba Runu, I want to speak about another iconic story. It's called Shaworoide. It's a 1999 political drama by Tunde Kelani. In that movie, a new king violates tradition, setting off a series of mishaps that divide the people, dissipate their commonwealth, and destroy the kingdom. Nigeria today is a real-life theater of political subterfuge, and the arrowhead of our present decline for the first time are the Yoruba. I say first time because from the time I was growing up as a child, it was typical for Yorubas to assume a moral superiority, and even other ethnic groups accorded us a cultural respect. We had a moral right, so to speak, to point fingers, pointing out the flaws in other ethnic groups and extolling our own historic uprightness. That time has gone. I, for one, no longer carry my chest boldly to say I am Yoruba. The contemporary associations of Yoruba are the sort that would have been frowned upon when leaders like Chief Awolowo or Chief Fumilayo Kuti were our embodiments. Even worse, there has been an unraveling. In front of our very eyes, leaders that we considered sacrosanct have fallen to levels that can only be described as unexpected. Recently, a thought leader who built his brand around the integrity of values and vision accepted a political appointment with the new administration. While it is his choice, it raised controversy about the alignment between his former position, on which he once ran a presidential campaign, and his new role in a government that straddles allegations of illegitimacy both home and abroad. Many more Nigerians, formerly of high repute, are unraveling. A lawyer who pioneered a democracy group that was instrumental in our struggle to end military rule recently issued a warning that appeared to muzzle public opinion in the ongoing debate about the genuineness of education credentials submitted during elections by our president. Many view this lawyer's recent statement as a strange tone, going by his former reputation. Talking about reputations, none was bigger than an iconic professor whose renown on the global stage is unparalleled. In fact, he was crowned a living deity among the Yorubas until recently, with statement after statement, openly denouncing the president's opponents. Many Nigerians are surprised to admit that this once radical anti-establishment intellectual has, as they say, eaten corn. Let's talk about corn. Corn is a euphemism for the campaign strategy of the present administration. It does not necessarily imply that those who eat it have accepted monetary benefits. Other considerations are also corn, such as long-term friendships, kinship, or the opportunity to be part of the political process. The important thing is the compromise in values that is difficult to defend without bending backwards. Values are the subject of today's podcast. Let's take an allegory, shall we? An allegory about ships or airplanes or cars. Any moving vehicle that must follow a certain course or lose direction. For cars, planes, or ships, course correction can mean the difference between arriving or crashing. So what can course correction mean for nations? If you follow the analogies about Hubert Ogunde's Yoruba Ronu or Tunde Kelani's Shaoroide, maybe the ongoing unraveling and social crises have been evolving since Nigeria was born. As such, maybe it is inevitable that one day design flaws or inborn errors will eventually force reckoning. If that is so, then Nigeria is on course. The question is, to where? Now, let's talk about issue. I have this book. I have been reading it religiously. It's possibly the biggest compendium on this subject. It's written by Professor Toyin Falola. I'll probably come back to this at another time. But for now, let's talk about what I say about issue. In Yoruba, issue is an orisha with a difficult reputation. Much of that reputation is colonial. The idea of whether issue is Satan or not. We must first understand that before colonization, there were other worldviews that did not need to have a Satan. Like we said in the beginning, the Yoruba are some of the oldest people on earth. One Harvard study estimates the Yoruba are at least 87,000 years old, from our ancient origins, long before we were collectively named Yoruba. Our understanding of the universe predates Middle Eastern belief systems, which introduced the character called Satan. Instead, Yoruba understand that good and evil are dual and embodied within nature, including you and me. All indigenous moral and legal systems, not just Yoruba, across Africa and Asia, South America, are karmic or retributive, meaning that what we sow is what we reap, just as in nature. Eshu for the Yoruba represents that principle. Eshu is the most scientific principle in the universe. In physics, the name for what issue represents is balance. Every physics equation contains the sign of balance. We call it the equals sign. Something on the left and a result on the right. And both the left and right sides of the equation must what? Balance. Without balance, there will be no universe. Balance is the most fundamental law of physics. And issue is of prior importance in Yoruba science. I want to read for you a quote that I conceived earlier this year. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay, it's in the iPad. This will make a little bit of sense as we go along. One moment, please. March 2023, I wrote this. I said, as long as we center Satan in explaining issue as what he is not, we fail to understand issue as what he is. Our concept, though decolonized, is still significantly warped and tainted by the intention to distinguish issue from Satan. We must start with a definition that does not center Satan at all, but clearly wants to know who is issue for issue's sake. Now let's continue. Why am I talking about issue? I recognize that my audience is mostly made up of Western educated middle class people, and many are therefore allergic to Orisha or even Ifa. I hope some of you will take the time to see that there is no science in Europe, United States, China, or Japan that does not have representation in the oldest compendiums of human knowledge out of Africa. So the question is not whether we have knowledge, it is how we have applied it. For example, most references to Ifa, Orisha, and so on are about worship. And while worship is one possible outcome of Ifa, it's not the only possible one. This computer I'm holding is built on the exact same mathematical analogies that are inside your Okwele Ifa and your Odu Ifa, exactly 256 bits, which are built into the processor in this computer and in the phones that you are using. How come some people who came long after us have taken that information and used it to create the supercomputer highway that rules all our lives today? In that sense, technology is the god of this world. And our own gods, well, they do have the same potential. But it's up to us, it's in our hands to determine what to do with Ifa. But let me read on. At some point, we as African civilizations need to have that conversation about epistemicide, meaning the erasure of pre-colonial knowledge, until we are firm about the global and indigenous nature of science. Science does not belong to a particular group of people. It's universal. Until we are clear about that, we will only ever be second best, if at all. For now, we consume and don't produce. Look around you in your households. 9 out of 10 things in your house are from abroad, and this is something we accept as normal. To manufacture on our own, we need to have scientific thought. Food for thought. Back to issue. Now that we've established issues' cosmic and scientific importance, away from all the colonial shenanigans, if issue is balance, we must redefine the popular idea that issue is a trickster. What we don't understand is that it is not issue that is tricking us. If at all, it is we as humans who trick ourselves by expecting to reap where we have not sown. Issue simply holds up a mirror saying, look at yourself. As arbiter and high judge of the universe, issue is above morality itself. You determine your moral outcomes. Issue only dishes up the mathematics and shows you your results. The Yoruba in Nigeria, blinded by personal tribal convictions, have mostly lined up behind a leader that represents our group without representing our values. What are our values? Omoluabi is the over 90,000-year-old constitution that preserves Yoruba cultural heritage. Let me read for you three of the attributes that make up Omoluabi. In Yoruba land, money has never been foremost in our value system. In our value system, money is number 5. What are the first 3 or 4? The first is Laakaye, which is the application of Ogbon, Imo, Oye, that is knowledge, wisdom, understanding. The second is Iyi, that is honor. Yoruba people place a premium on the gait with which individuals carry themselves and their public reputation. A good name, better than gold. For instance, when the late Pa Abraham Adesoya and Adekunle Ajashin were made leaders, they were not the richest. When Ma Fumilayo Kuti led Abeokuta women against the colonial tax authorities, she was not the richest. That is why Yoruba people usually say that when you set out to look for money and you meet honor on the way, then you don't need the journey anymore. Because if you get the money, you will still use it to buy honor. Iyi is usually associated with integrity. Someone with integrity is a man of his words. Who they say they are is who they are. If you have all the wealth in the world but lack integrity, it means nothing. Integrity is combined with Iwa, character, which is what makes Omoluabi. And the third is Anishelapa Enitiki Shiole, which means having a visible means of livelihood. Remember when we used to say that if you come home with a lot of new things, a new car, a lot of money, your parents will ask you, where did you get it from? And if you don't have a good answer, there's trouble. I think those days are gone. You know, when it comes to the election of the current president and his administration, there is a sensible side of the story. Because again, I told that Yoruba we are TBT people, good and evil exist together. There's a sensible side to how we made this choice, but there's also a downside, and I'll explain both. Because Yoruba exists within an amalgamated nation, that we and the other ethnic nations have never really fully agreed on how we want to coexist. It creates problems over and over again. There's a sense of competition, especially for the high offices, because as far as we are concerned, these high offices and political positions are a means of dispensing patronage. From the beginning to now, we have hardly used politics for development. It's for dispensing patronage. If you are within the elite or within the circle of the people in power, you are good. If you are not, you're on your own. So to compete in such an order, Yoruba, not just Yoruba, any of the ethnic nations who is supporting candidates has to look for a candidate that has 2 things to decide what they will support. So number 1, the candidate needs to have a political network. A political network that is superior to the political networks of the other candidates. So you throw your weight behind that candidate, knowing that that candidate has the propensity to close all the gaps, meet all the right people, do all the right lobby, and get everybody on their side to galvanize the electoral system and to win. Political networks are important. Our candidates whom we supported in this election as a group had the strongest of political networks at the time. It's a different question how that network was acquired or what are the ethical merits or, that's a secondary issue. But this candidate did have that power, the political network. And so it made sense to support that candidate in that way. The second quality that the different ethnic nationalities in Nigeria will look for in an election season is money. Because again, the democratic practice that we have copied is transactional, highest bidder. It's not unique to us. If you go to America today, and even Europe, they do their own in sophisticated ways, but power belongs to people who control the levers of the economy. So the candidate that Yoruba supported in this election was the one that had the biggest, money bag, the one who could really move the cash levers to make sure that everything swings his way. And why am I saying this? I'm saying that now our values, if they be called that, for making this choice, though they are sensible and logical, they're also contradictory to the original set of Yoruba values, which Ogunde warned us about and said, we are now divided on what is really our representation, what is it that makes us Yoruba. So I wanted you to think about it for a moment. Let's say we didn't have Nigeria to deal with. Let's say there was no competition between us and other ethnic races to decide who gets the top position and therefore who gets political patronage. Let's say we didn't have that issue and we were a Yoruba nation on our own. would we have allowed a person of controversial character to represent our nation? At this point, I want to clarify an assumption. There are those amongst us who assume that one has to be affiliated to one political party or the other, or have certain interests in order to speak for or against the truth. That is what led to the previous example I gave about people who are eating corn. And I said eating corn is not merely about collecting money. You may decide to support a candidate because of the relationship between you and that candidate, even if you know that candidacy also contradicts the values that are in the best interest of the majority. All of that, compromise, corn is compromise. Compromise of values, because this is about values. If you believe what I explained earlier about issue, you will see that none of our opinions or affiliations or interests matter. The universe does not recognize whether you are Yoruba, Hausa, or Igbo. It is we who make these arguments about tribe. Personally, I feel for the first time that issue has turned against us. It should be a cause for sober reflection. A seed the Yoruba sowed, whether this year or in previous years, has germinated and unraveled our race, making us the laughing stock of people we once criticized as our moral inferiors. It is time for Yoruba Ronu, not the appropriated, abused, corrupted version of that idea, just the authentic inward reflection that Ogunde once ordered. But to reflect with integrity, you have to be Omoluabi. And being Yoruba and Omoluabi are not always the same thing. Let me close. We are living in a fast-changing world. So much change that the World Economic Forum has coined a new term, polycrisis. It mirrors the biblical prophecy of an end-time great tribulation. Let me read from a quote that I shared earlier this year about the polycrisis. The new terminology is polycrisis. The World Economic Forum chose this word early this year to capture the combination of crises: cost of living, global poverty, new diseases, gas prices, Ukraine war, looming nuclear annihilation, mental health crisis, racism, climate change, and many more. In the words of the WEF, the new phrasing is needed because the sum of all the crises is more than their parts, as if there's some kind of X factor, a multiplier effect within this great tribulation. Polycrisis. We have even more existential, human, social crises, such as the unraveling of old ideas and old systems, the challenges of de-dollarization and decolonization. These are times that require the best leaders. Every nation must choose its best 11. This is not the time to allow tribal sentiment to divide us or corrupt our values. Tides are turning, and only strong nations will survive the polycrisis, or the tribulation if you prefer that expression. My reflection is that as Yorubas in particular, and Nigerians in general, my generation has failed. And that failure is an inheritance we receive from our parents' generation. Our failure is not merely political or economic, it is largely moral and ethical. Our value system has not survived colonization. Neither did our values survive subsequent militarization and the current civilian democracy. Through all these stages, our parents taught us to prioritize tribe at the expense of nation, and religious morality at the expense of traditional laws of balance, accountability, and responsibility. Our indigenous karmic retributive understanding of collective consciousness would have preserved us from openly embracing the current failing of values, the unraveling that threatens to wipe out every gain since independence and even impose future burdens on the next generations. Talking about generations, I have this to say. If there is hope that Nigeria will undo the harm we have done to ourselves by descending into tribal hell, it is the youngest amongst us who must lead the charge. those whose ideas and values are the least affected by the old ways of doing things. So no generation is sacrosanct, but the older must accept responsibility, and the younger must collaborate with the older. All of us must reflect together, learn our history, and preserve our culture. Only on top of our values can we build a new nation. Thanks for listening. What are your thoughts? Comment below, click the follow button, subscribe, and share with your friends. Till next time, Ireo.